All right. Thank y'all so much for joining us today. My name is Dominique Baker, and I'll talk a little bit more about who I am later, but we're really excited to have y'all get a chance to hear some more about some of our latest work. So we're here today to talk about the local funding of community colleges. And really, we're going to get into sort of what even is the local funding of community colleges. But in basics, we know that community colleges receive revenue from the localities that they serve, but prior research hasn't really been able to explore the specific sources of where that funding comes from or how different types of local funding sources are associated with the characteristics of institutions themselves. So we're really excited to get a chance to talk about that today. This research was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but the findings and conclusions contained within are those of the authors, us lovely people here on the screen, and do not necessarily reflect the positions or policies of the foundation. So, like I said, let's just start off right at the top with who these people are in the screens. So my name is Dominique Baker. I'm an associate professor of education and public policy at the University of Delaware. I will let my colleagues introduce themselves.
I'll kick off. My name is Justin Ortegas. I'm an associate professor of higher education at the University of Florida, and I also direct the Institute of Higher Education and the College of Education at the University of Florida. And I'll kick it over to Dr. Kelchin.
Hi, everyone. I just had that fun end of semester issue with the webcam failing, so I just got another one brought to me. So I'm all set. Robert Kelchin, professor of education, head of the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you all. I'm Kelly Rossinger. I'm an associate professor of education and public policy at Penn State University, and I'll turn it over to Zyra.
Hello, I'm Zyra Shea Smith-Onyewu. I am a postdoctoral scholar and incoming assistant professor at the University of Florida.
So I am your moderator today, which means apologies in advance because you're just going to be hearing a lot about this. I'll do my best not to make Real Housewives references. For those who have ever seen me moderate before, you know that this will be a fight that I will be doing with myself. But generally speaking, I want to make sure I just go over what our agenda looks like for today. And do a couple of housekeeping things. So this is being recorded. So if for whatever reason you have to get off early or things like that, please know that we'll put this recording up on our website and you will be able to access it in case there's something you missed or if you want to share with someone else. So just making sure you're aware. And so what we're going to have is Justin is going to do an overview of the work we've been engaged with. And that's going to happen for about 10 minutes, give or take. Then we're going to have a panel where we get a chance to get a little bit deeper into some of the thorny questions about just what is this local funding? What are the different sources? How do they relate to different sets of institutions? What we think that might mean for how we holistically fund colleges and universities in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. And then we'll have some space for questions from the audience. So as the presentations go along, if you have any questions pop up, please feel free to message to Kelly Rossinger, and she'll be collecting those questions. And that way we can make sure that they get asked at the end. If we don't have enough time for all of the questions, we will certainly, we can do things like answer them over email, stuff like that. This does not have to be the end of a conversation. We hope that this is just the start of a conversation about local funding and community colleges. So like I said, thank you all so much for giving us some of your time, and I'm going to turn this over to Justin so he can give a high-level overview on local funding for community colleges.
All right, thank you, Dominique. Hopefully everyone can see the shared screen. Excitable head nods, thank you. Okay, so basically I'm going to give us kind of a brief overview of the landscape of local funding for community colleges, a little bit about what we know, and then kind of lead into what we're going to be discussing here today with some of the emergent work we have to show based on local funding sources for community colleges. So with that in mind, the motivation. First and foremost, community colleges and thinking about the mission, the first criterion that comes to mind is access. So folks who may be facing a host of time constraints or location constraints there's an institution down the road where they can, engage higher education and hopefully improve the status of their lives. So this is a key underpinning of what we think about when we think about the purpose and role of community colleges. In addition to that, of course, developmental education is a major component. So some folks may come to higher education not prepared to take college level courses, and a major component of community colleges is preparing those students and having that open access mission continue to connect to that second criterion as well. Certainly one would think about vertical transfer. All that means is to get folks ready to transfer to a 4-year college or university. That's certainly a component of a community college. And then finally, from a mission perspective, responding to the local economy's demands. So from the workforce perspective, just really an emergent and critical component of the community college mission. So when thinking about that open access component, we're also going to think about who disproportionately is attending community colleges. And that's kind of a key takeaway as well when we start talking about some of the findings from this work and why we care about implications for local funding for students particularly. So first and foremost, disproportionate share of low-income students are at community colleges, a high share of racially minoritized students, specifically Black students and Hispanic students as well. Academically disadvantaged folks, just based on that open access mission, are disproportionately attending community colleges, and a lot of folks with familial responsibilities, such as parents and full-time employees who may have some really challenging dynamics with their schedule, and then kind of engaging community colleges with that context in mind. So we're talking about local funding, but there's also some broader funding conversations to be had to really think about why we care about local funding. So first and foremost, community colleges receive a little over $2,000 per full-time equivalent student in local appropriations on average, according to some recent descriptive work. And the important takeaway here is that overall, community colleges receive substantially fewer state-level resources per full-time equivalent student relative to 4-year institutions, which really makes local funding come to the forefront as a critical potential resource for community colleges. And there's been some work showing that dual-funded community colleges, meaning they receive both state funding and local funding, could be the strategy moving forward to try to make sure community colleges have the resources they need to educate students. So recent work has also shown that local funding makes up a little less than 1/3 of total revenues among the community colleges that are locally supported. And it's really important to note overall, only state appropriations and tuition revenue are a higher share of the average community college's total revenue when compared to local funding. So we had some recent work that's forthcoming in AERA Open, and really what we showed was twofold. One is we use kind of national data from IPEDS to really set up what we're going to talk about here today and show that the local funding has a positive influence on total institutional revenue when looking at all public community colleges, or the pooled sample of community colleges in the US. So the logic there is that local funding can potentially supplement or complement state appropriations in ways that can try to close some of those gaps or benefit a historically underfunded sector of higher education. The problem is when you start to think about for whom or which institutions are benefiting or not benefiting from these policies, and that's where we have some really critical findings for that second major takeaway of that paper. And kind of in thinking about that, we also show that community colleges' level of reliance on local funding is negatively related to their total institutional revenue for the specific subgroups of institutions focused on rural community colleges and the community colleges serving an above average share of low-income students. This makes intuitive sense when one thinks about the areas of kind of the community colleges that are serving low-income students and why that has implications for localities and wealthy areas and lower income areas. And we're going to talk about all those dynamics a little bit later and why this intuitively is a very interesting thing to consider from a policy perspective when talking about local funding and community colleges. So broadly speaking, in the higher education literature, very little is known regarding the role and influence of specific local funding sources. And this is really going to motivate a lot of what we're talking about here today. So property taxes, some of us pay them begrudgingly, and we all hopefully know about them. And really the big takeaway there is it's the most commonly acknowledged source of local funding to community colleges. And it really has been shown in K-12 scholarship is kind of leading to some inequities. So the logic there is that the wealthier districts have more property taxes and more local funding to disproportionately benefit those schools and students. And the lower income districts have the opposite effect, where there's fewer resources to go to those schools and those students. And this makes an incredibly salient thing to consider for higher education, to think about community colleges as well. So other local tax sources have been outlined in public budgeting and taxation literature outside of property taxes. And this really led us to start thinking about, well, what are those for higher education? What is the extent to which this matters? And what can we learn in moving forward in trying to better understand this kind of studied area of scholarship? So the other areas of local funding sources include sales taxes, income taxes, gasoline taxes, alcohol taxes, and of course, utilities. And what we really tried to think about are there some ways to categorize or group these local funding sources to try to add insight to what we're going to be talking about here today in our emergent work as well. So before getting into that, I'm going to talk a little bit about our data collection for the study that we're going to be talking about today. For the past couple of years, we've been collecting information on local funding sources. So the sample is a 5-year panel looking at all public community colleges in the US, excluding Alaska. So that's a little over 4,700 institution year observations in the data set. In data elements, there are quite a few, but I'm just going to hit the highlights here and note that we're looking at the amount of local appropriations, the operating and non-operating revenues, and other revenues to consider as well. So the sources of local funding are another critical component of the data set. So we're going to be outlining whether it's property taxes, sales taxes, and there's a pretty long list of different types of taxes I'm going to talk about briefly in a future slide as we wrap up this overview. And as far as data sources, what we use and what we consider, audited financial statements, government documents, legal statute, correspondence with experts and officials and state personnel as well as local personnel or community college personnel. We're really trying to knock on every door possible to make sure that we optimize our information and come away with the best outlook and picture of local funding in the United States for community colleges. So earlier I referenced some groups or categories to consider, and we're borrowing from other literatures in doing that. And this is the final slide before I turn it over to my colleague, the great Dr. Baker, to get us going in our conversation. So there are 4 different groups we're going to talk about here. First is property taxes, or what you own. So there are property taxes, not just residential, there are others to consider with commercial, industrial, and there's some other real estate taxes as well whenever you sell a home and pay taxes, so on and so forth. The second one is consumption taxes, or what you buy, and that's a long list that you can see there, but I'll just highlight a few as sales tax, gambling taxes, and just broader types of entertainment, food, alcohol, etc. So these are kind of other considerations for grouping local funding sources as well. Third is income taxes. That's pretty straightforward. That's income that's being taxed locally. So I'm not going to delve too deeply into that. And then there were some that didn't quite fit as neatly into these categories, and we identify those as other taxes. So business taxes and a whole host of others that we tried to document in the data set as best we could, but not going to delve in too deeply right now. I'm going to get a little bit more into that in the future. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Dr. Baker for our conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Justin. And one of the things I want to mention is if you have questions that pop up, you can also put them in the Q&A. And so that's another source that as you were thinking about those pieces, as we start talking a little bit more deeply about what we found, if you have more questions that come up, that's a different space that you can also share that we'll also be collecting. Okay, so Justin, I'd love to better understand sort of what do we know broadly about inequities and local funding between community colleges?
Yeah, thanks, Dominique. And I think importantly, the word to tease out from what you just said is broadly. And let's first take a step back and think even beyond local funding, what do we know about community college funding at various levels? So first and foremost, community colleges as institutions, they're educating the folks with the greatest needs, and they're often funded the least. And this is kind of the financial reality and the embedded inequity for community colleges before we even start to consider local funding. And for local funding, as we just showed in some of that recent scholarship, the question really becomes, can local funding close gaps, or will local funding exacerbate gaps for those who need funding the most? And that's a critical consideration. So when we think about local funding and the primary source being property taxes, even if we talk about the previous component of K-12 literature, and how we kind of have seen pretty robustly and consistently in K-12 literature that there are these like funding gaps or these inequities between lower income school districts and wealthier school districts, and bringing that over and really considering these dynamics for higher education. We know this is something to flag and consider and to be mindful of. And our recent work showed that it's actually likely harming rural students and low income students attending community colleges as well. So the broad question is, you know, can local funding close gaps? And in the pooled analysis, it seems like local funding can be a good thing overall, but we really have to be mindful from a policy perspective about making sure that it's not only helping certain subgroups of institutions and students, and really being mindful of that moving forward when having these conversations. And that really sets up something I'll talk about a little bit later, which is what are the next steps for research? But that's generally what we know, and happy to kind of hear my colleagues talk through some of these other dynamics as well.
Great, thank you. So then, Zaira, keeping that in mind, how do the sources of local funding between community colleges differ? And sort of like, how are they related to what we know about colleges?
Thanks, Dominique. To answer your question, I'm gonna get Justin to please share his screen one more time. I'm going to share some of our preliminary data on some of the patterns that we found. So to start, as Justin said, we had 4,721 observations. And these observations lied within two different types of states. You have those with local funding, which made up about 74% of the observations, while the remainder of the observations were within states without local funding. So the next slide, we're going to dig more into what about those institutions that lie in local funding states. As you can see, even though all these colleges lie within local funding states, that doesn't mean that they all receive local funding. So there's a little bit of a distinction that we see there. So getting into our research questions, how is local funding or the local funding sources associated with institutional characteristics? So one thing we see when we look at the frequency of local funding, like the types of taxes that are used to fund these institutions, overall, when we consider all of our data, we see that amongst institutions that receive what we see is that more institutions receive funding from property taxes than those who do not receive funding from property taxes. However, a substantially lower proportion of institutions observations, receive funding from the other types of sources as we've categorized them and collapsed them into these fewer groups. So income taxes, consumption taxes, and other types of taxes. As you can see, that light blue bar is much lower compared to the dark blue bar. On the next slide, we think about the relative reliance on local funding and how that's associated with the different types of taxes that institutions receive funding from. So to put that into context, what do I mean by the relative reliance on local funding? What we're doing is comparing the amount of funding via local appropriations that an institution receives as a proportion of the total revenues that the institution receives. So we collapse those into two categories, those that are above and those that are below the national average. And what we see is that when it comes to property and income taxes, those institutions that receive those institutions that are have an above average reliance on local funding are more frequently receiving property taxes and income taxes. However, when we look at the other two groups, we see that there's a reversal. So the proportion of observations that receive consumption taxes and other types of taxes actually is higher. The frequency is higher among those that are below the national average in their reliance on local funding. Moving on from there, we looked at the relative proportion of minority students served by these observations, by these institutions. So again, we're looking at, do these institutions serve above or below the national average and their proportion of minority students? And how is that related to the types of tax sources that they receive? Funnily, again, we see that property and income taxes, they're relatively the same. So whether or not they're above or below the average proportions, the frequency is pretty much the same when we look at institutions that receive these types of taxes. However, looking at institutions that receive consumption and funding from other types of taxes, we see that a larger proportion of these institutions are actually serving below average proportions of minoritized students. So moving on to low income students, another group that we're interested in, amongst all of the groups, we see a similar pattern that given any source of any source of taxes that are received, we see that they all have a higher frequency of serving below average proportions of low income students, which is very interesting. And then finally, we looked at rurality. And so what we see here is that among institutions that received property taxes and income taxes, there is a higher frequency. They're more likely to be non-rural institutions. However, that script flips when we look at consumption and other types of taxes, where we see that institutions or observations that receive these types of revenues are actually more likely to be rural institutions. So that summarizes some of the data that we found.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So it's the like tale as old as time in higher education, that the name of the game is variation, right? That we sort of have different sets of institutions that are funded in different ways. And there seems to be some potential patterns to how some of that funding is happening, especially when it comes to both the who the institution serves and also where the institution is located. That's interesting. I'm sort of curious, and maybe Robert, you can speak a little bit about this. How does the variation in local funding sources sort of interact with how we think about the larger landscape of community college funding? Thinking about like holistically states and the feds and all of that, like how do we put what Zara was just telling us about into that context?
Yeah, you can think about community college funding primarily in three buckets. You can think about state funding, local funding, and then what students pay in tuition, which is very often subsidized through federal financial aid. And there's a tremendous amount of variation across the country in resources that community colleges have, as well as the relative importance of each of those three sources. And a great example of this is the way the community college system was set up in New Jersey. When it was set up about 60 years ago now, it was designed to where the states paid a third, the individual counties paid a third, and students paid a third in tuition. And since then, it's gotten a little bit away from that to where students are paying 50 to 60% of the overall cost of education in tuition. And the counties are 20 some odd percent and the state's about 20%. So it's a pretty common case where if there is local funding, states may not exactly have the same incentive to keep funding up. But on the other hand, if states are funding, then the question is how much do localities need to kick in? And we have some really interesting cases across the country where there are some community colleges within a state that are supplemented by local funding, others aren't. We have states where there are separate community college and technical college systems, where one of them is state funded, one is local funded. And then there's also another part of the post-secondary system, which is largely outside the scope of this study, but it's post-secondary education done by local school districts, which is almost entirely locally funded, but those tend to be very short-term certificate, and data quality often isn't there, so they aren't a part of this study. But there is just such tremendous variation in how much localities fund, that interaction with state aid, and then also even the relative importance of federal financial aid, which is based on how much tuition is, how much students need the financial aid, and also how much students qualify for. And on top of that, we have some community colleges that opt out of participating in the federal student loan program and therefore limit students' access to federal financial aid. When you've seen one community college or one community college system, you have seen one community college or one community college system, and we have a whole bunch of these across the country.
That's so interesting, especially I think when we talk about sort of funding for higher education, and we are frequently thinking about the money that like the federal government might infuse and how we think about a maintenance of effort on the part of the state, right? Like how if the federal government's going to give more funding, are we going to ensure that the state continues giving its share? And what's really interesting that you're talking about is also the same way when we think about like states and local funding and the way that if we're going to add in more local funding, how do we ensure that the state still maintains effort, vice versa? It's also probably a little bit challenging trying to think about over time what it means if both the state and local funding have reduced some of their portion of the pie, and that's being passed on to students and their families as well. Okay, so that's really interesting. So then, Zyra, could you comment a little bit on like how might different sources of local funding influence like potential inequities between community colleges? So you helped us to think about the fact that there appear to be patterns in how the funding sources are laid out. It doesn't appear to be random, the way that funding sources are associated with different sets of community colleges. And so thinking about how Robert's sort of given us all this context, how might we think that these different local funding sources might play a role in inequities between community colleges?
Yeah, so my mind immediately goes to I like how you made the parallel between the federal and state government and the state and the local governments. This reminds me of the parallel between like K-12 and higher education, right? So if we look at like, the K-12 literature, I mean, it's showing that there's a disparity in between districts. There's like inequities between districts, especially when it comes to like student outcomes and funding. And that's associated with the revenues that these institutions receive. There's literature pointing to that at the post-secondary level as well. But why do we see this? Part of it is associated with the amount of revenues that are received by these institutions, and these revenues come from different sources. So if we think about property taxes, I believe somewhere between 60 and 75% of these institutional revenues come from property taxes if we look at that revenues as a whole. So if you have two different districts who are who have different amounts of revenues coming from property taxes, that means that one district, the more wealthy district, if you have like more mansions or just higher property taxes, they may generate more revenue that can provide more for the community college compared to an alternate district. But if we think about it in other ways, you can see the same thing if we think about income taxes, right? If you're living in a district where there are individuals who are just wealthier, you know, they're paying more in income tax, that district can provide more to the community college and therefore may produce different outcomes for the students, or they just may serve different types of students. But we may see a difference if we think about other types of revenue, such as gambling taxes. The amount of revenue generated by gambling taxes may not be related to the income or any type of other like characteristics of the population that are associated with differences in income and property taxes. So then we might see less of a disparity in the amount of revenues received by those institutions. So when we think about these things all together, maybe that's why we see a difference between different types of institutions in regards to who they serve and where they're located. We're still working through these things. Based on the data that I showed you, we're moving forward to do some regressions to try to tease apart some of the differences that we have kind of touched on today. So this is just a start.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think it's, it's so tricky because it would be very challenging for someone, thankfully not us, but someone to think from like a causal perspective, right? In part because I think it's so hard to separate what spaces would be allowed to have an income tax or a property tax that has the resources to be able to funnel to an institution, right? As I was sort of saying, right, like this doesn't just plop down randomly across the country where, oh yeah, sure, you could do a property tax part and you could do gambling and those sorts of things. And so it's really trying to holistically understand localities and states to think about like what funding sources are even potentially viable for different types of community colleges. Yeah, that's very it's very challenging for someone else. So then Robert, could you talk a little bit about sort of what are the findings that we have so far? Tell us about the current state of sort of higher education finance policy and how it might be able to inform future policy.
Yeah. First of all, this is really complicated case by case just because of the mosaic of funding strategies and also just the mosaic of available resources. And then something we haven't talked about as much today is what are the conditions that colleges have to meet in order to get local funding or to get state funding? We've seen a few cases where local funding just disappears in certain years. And there have been a couple community colleges that were at least threatened with loss of local funding because politicians didn't like their response to the Middle East situation. This is community colleges. There's not a ton going on there in terms of high profile protests. And in terms of state funding models, are they being incentivized enrollment, completions, equity? What's going on there? And the big thing I'm thinking about right now is community college enrollment is super countercyclical, meaning when we get a recession, enrollment tends to go up. That's also when state funding and also local funding are under the most pressure. Will that happen during the next recession, given concerns about the value of higher education? Will community colleges have the resources to support the students that they get? And how many students will they get? And then I'm also really fascinated about just the trend of consolidated governance for community colleges, where several states, for example, Connecticut, they're well underway to combine their community colleges into one unit. Indiana did this about 20 years ago with Ivy Tech. What does that mean for the possibility of local funding in certain states? Does it all get stripped off into state funding? And then what does it mean for access in local communities? And then finally, in states where community colleges are decentralized and there's flexibility in terms of where you set the districts for community colleges, are colleges going to try to be really strategic about the areas they serve to try to get the best resources possible? This has happened especially in Texas, where community colleges have been very strategic to try to get the most affluent areas in their boundaries. And as resources continue to get tighter, will there be more pressure to only serve the areas that are the most profitable to do so?
Yeah, for those in the audience who don't know, I used to live in Texas, and everything that Robert's saying, right? It's like really interesting and important that you could sort of control some of your boundaries around who is your base, who are the people that you're serving in community colleges, especially if you don't have a traditional thing like the way you were saying about New Jersey, which is a county-based community college system. When you have spaces where that is not the case and you don't have county-based, that can really trip up just who community colleges believe they're serving.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Also, as an aside, I really enjoyed your phrasing on the mosaic. And so do not be shocked when I steal that. Okay, great. So Justin, could you help us to think about like what would be useful next steps in research? I've sort of already outlined the ways that causal research might be incredibly challenging, but I think that there's a lot of space for really important and powerful descriptive work as well. And so I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that. And I'll remind folks, people are starting to put some really interesting questions in the Q&A. So I'll remind people that you can do that, because after this question, we'll switch over to chatting a little bit with audience questions.
So the first step for next research is to try to convince Connecticut not to combine other colleges into one deal like Indiana. That was troubling of you to share, Robert. That's very challenging from a research perspective. But I would say like one key project is really what I want to hone in on here and talk about what we're thinking about as a research team directly in response to this work that we're doing. And that kind of our next priority as a research team then kind of shifts over to the role and the influence of state level redistribution of local funds. This is something that we've seen be critically important across the US, and it's something where it wasn't a component of our initial proposal, analysis, report, or plans, but it's something that we see as really important. So in moving forward, trying to think through that, we know that several states have responded to these kind of conversations about inequities to making sure that every community college in their state has the baseline necessity to educate their students, right? So we talk about this in literature as far as like minimum threshold funding, base plus funding, whatever somebody wants to say. It's just in general, making sure you have what you need to educate students adequately, or whatever phrase one wants to use. And in theory, this kind of state level redistribution would remove these understandable concerns about residential property taxes and conversations we've had about the amount of local funds going to community colleges in affluent areas relative to community colleges going into lower income areas. So really trying to better understand state level redistribution, the extent to which it matters, who's helped, who's harmed. These are really important considerations moving forward. And just from like a policy perspective, first, we're going to think about, the presence of state level redistributions of local funding, the extent to which it is in place across these different states that affect obviously many localities, but also think about some policy details regarding whether the redistribution is based on institutional enrollment. There are some policies on district size or institutional revenue considerations. There's a whole lot of information out there that's just kind of ripe for more of this descriptive type work to better to allow us to better understand the dynamics of local funding and what it means for community colleges seeking to navigate these complex dynamics that we've been talking about throughout this webinar. So I think state level redistribution, to put it clearly, would probably be our next step as far as thinking about future research.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you everyone for your thoughtful answers to my questions. And so we're gonna switch into doing a little bit of audience Q&A. We did have some new folks join, so just as a reminder, if you joined us in media res, right in the middle, don't worry. We are recording this and putting it up on our website. So if you go to informedstates.org/webinars, a recording of that will be up sooner rather than later. And so in case you missed like some of our figures or things like that, you don't have to worry, you'll be able to see things that way. And so I am going to start reading out some questions, and whoever wants to is welcome to answer first. So first, how do community colleges strategically leverage local funding to support diverse student populations and address the needs of their local communities?
I'll start us off, just kind of like high level conversation. I don't know if I have a perfect answer to that question, but there are a whole kind of like host of strategies one can have to better serve their local communities. So if you know in your community that you have students who have transportation issues, and you could really try to be mindful of support and services tied to making sure students can get to campus. This has been a real push in New York and other states in trying to make sure that some of the location constraints tied to community colleges and some of the conversations we've had earlier can be a priority. There are also offices for support and services, depending on the student subgroup one is discussing, that can be leveraged and supported by local funds. That's certainly something that can be a consideration for diverse kind of subgroups of students. Open to other folks with other kind of takeaways for what community colleges can do, but those are two initial examples that come to mind.
Yeah, the way I'd approach this, the same answer would be true for state funding, is finding ways to really align the priorities of the funder and the institution. So if a local community really wants a particular service, offering that service is a good way to potentially get yourself more funds. And it's just building that sense of community that can really help support the community college.
So then, who has the authority to change sort of like the tax rates that go into local funding? And what this is just going to say, like from a broader standpoint, and maybe I'll kick it to you, Zaire, first, but just thinking like, is this about local policymakers in general who sort of have the authority to make decisions? Does it look like this might be something that like ballot initiatives or referendum might be able to do? Are there any sorts of insights we can provide around that?
So it's a great question. The constituency within the locality actually has a major voice when it comes to what funding sources are used to sustain the local community college. There's literature about how different types of localities may have different preferences for different types of tax revenue sources that they're willing to use to fund local community colleges. For example, while one community may be all for property taxes, and we know that property taxes are usually used to fund these community colleges, another community may advocate more for sales taxes, wherever they're given reason based on the economy of that community or their local characteristics. They play a major role. So it's not a top-down thing. It's not our politicians telling us, hey, we're going to use gambling taxes. We're going to implement income taxes. We as citizens have our voice, and it is us as a group within each individual locality that helps to determine what types of tax revenue sources are used to fund local community colleges.
So the way I'm thinking about this, please correct me if I'm wrong, is almost when I go on election day and I see like a number of things listed that are about like a bond for a school and this sort of tax will be done for this. Like that's frequently how these types of things are handled in a lot of different localities where individual residents sort of have a bit of a say in how the funding is going to the community colleges. Got it.
That's
Perfect.
correct. That's right. So even in places where there may be a base state sales tax, there could be a referendum on an election ballot that says, hey, we want to increase our county sales tax by 1% so that all that revenue can be used to fund the community college, whether it be for capital or just for operations. That is it's a thing. So yeah, you're right.
No, I love it because I talked all that jive about how difficult this would be for causal work. And I'm certain if anyone who loves voting RD heard this, they just thought through some ways to potentially get some causal estimates. You are welcome, someone. It won't be me. So let's go to a different question. Okay, so I've got a provocative question for you. So the question says, right, that like they are willing to admit that local funding might be a stabilizing force for revenue, especially in states that have maintenance of effort. But local funding could sort of be considered kind of regressive as you think about it as a funding source, because who pays is really important, right? We could imagine where low-income households are paying a greater share of income. And that also may be true for people who have no intention of going to college. So I'll sort of throw that out there to y'all. What are the ways that we think about local funding within a sort of regressivity system framework?
I can start this because that's something we considered when we were thinking about how to even classify these tax sources. We were considering progressive versus regressive types of taxes. What we found is that it's kind of hard to put any type of tax into a category, right? So income taxes can be progressive, it can be very regressive, or even property taxes can be progressive or regressive. There's like a continuum depending on how the policy is structured. So it can vary from place to place. So I don't think that we can just say that any type of tax is necessarily progressive or regressive, but how we have to think about how those taxes are structured and how they're used to generate revenue.
Yeah, I would say that was my prior as far as coming into this project. I kind of had a similar takeaway, but I think one thing that Zyra is flagging is that sometimes it's more complicated. And we're finding, especially, and as an example, these redistributions we're discussing, really try to take account for making sure that they're not blatantly regressive. Certainly some types of local funding sources, the most obvious example and the most popular example of residential property taxes, one can imagine where kind of local funding sources can disproportionately harm low-income students. But one thing that's challenging about regressivity is oftentimes you think about like lottery funds and that poorer folks are paying the majority of the share, they're not getting the benefits. This is like a little bit more complex as far as like the different sources we're discussing and who's helped and who's harmed. But in general, I think the high level takeaway we agree on that there's some potential for some regressive components, and the notion of a dual funded community college can be a good thing in the pooled analysis, such that when there's a clear disparity in state funds going to community colleges, local funds can help narrow those gaps. And then we are concerned about the regressive component that was flagged there and really trying to be thorough and thoughtful in seeing when that's a thing and when that may not be a thing, even though one's prior could be that it's certainly a challenge moving forward.
And also there are state funding formulas in a few states that take into account the amount of local funding or the amount of local funding capacity. So you can think of equalization funding, which is much more common in K-12 education finance, but we see it in a few cases for community college finance as well.
And so, Robert, I'll stick with that for a moment, because someone else had a question just more broadly. Like, are there any funding sort of formulas that we know of that are explicitly, excuse me, about how local funding is dispersed? Or is it more that when we see it, it's sort of like what you just were talking about?
Yeah, I don't think there are many explicit local funding formulas out there because local governments are typically just funding one institution. So they're just kind of making their gut instinct. I'm not aware of any localities that are saying we're trying to fund this certain amount per FTE. Zyra, do you recall seeing any of those?
No, I don't remember seeing any of that in the data.
I wouldn't say it's just local funding, but certainly enrollment is a criterion for these redistribution of local funds conversations at the state level. So it's certainly a thing that has a formula tied to it where local funds are being dispersed or redispersed based on enrollment across those states that have that formula in place. But it's not just restricted to local funding. There's a state level component in the equalization or redistribution or whatever term one wants to use. That's where that comes into play, at least from the data we've reviewed.
Okay, so this is another really interesting question that it's okay if you take a moment to think about. So I'm going to add some of my own thoughts as well. So the question's asking, y'all are shocked. Okay. Do you believe that due to the large number of online courses being offered, the role of community colleges in providing access to higher education may be undergoing review? And this really got me thinking a lot about institutions, sort of spinoffs as well, things like Purdue Global, or these pieces of institutions that are explicitly focused on the access mission, but may potentially have set up a different enrollment pathway, a different credentialing pathway as well. And really part of the question is around, if we think that one of the key modes and one of the key points of community colleges is this access mission, sort of what Justin was talking about at the beginning of the overview, do we think that other institutions opening up their access might affect or shift the sources of funding for community colleges?
It's an interesting question because the logic of a lot of these, especially exclusively online degree programs, is tied to the notion of removing the time constraints and the location constraints that are disproportionately, plaguing community college students. So it's a fair kind of connection to then go say, well, does this kind of change the formula moving forward as far as the utility and value and purpose of community colleges, given that we can remove those constraints at the 4-year level with online offerings? I guess my concern would be In a lot of the research that I've carried out previously, we see some positive effects of taking some online courses in a community college context. So it can be used kind of as a supplement toward the pathway to degree completion and allows students to have greater flexibility. So it can be a consideration. But these exclusively online degree programs are just really harmful to the same types of students who are disproportionately attending community colleges. So I would really urge caution to just kind of barrel into the online education as this panacea and like step aside community colleges. And I would really think through the implications of those types of decisions. But I think it's a really nice supplement. I would argue it's just not something that can supplant the mission and role of community colleges. But it's a fascinating question because, as you flagged, Dominique, there are some parallels that are useful to consider.
And another challenge worth discussing in this is which programs at community or technical colleges can be done online. I think there's certainly a push across all of higher education to try to consolidate course offerings at the state or system level where possible. But for especially technical education fields, that's not as possible. But I think we have seen a trend of community colleges looking very closely at all the sites that they're offering, even just within their service area, offering fewer sites and focusing those sites more on the technical education side that can't be potentially put online.
Just agreeing with what Robert said, I think that it's important that we keep in mind, as Justin said at the very beginning of his presentation, what are some of what is the mission of community colleges? These community colleges, with some exceptions, are generally meant to help students towards associate degrees. I think about, you mentioned, Dominique, Purdue Global. Here in Maryland, we have University of Maryland Global Campus. But a lot of those programs are geared towards bachelor's degrees. You know, that doesn't align with the mission of community college. Therefore, it can't supplant the mission and the work of a community college, you know? And then also thinking about the needs of students, just to kind of summarize what Justin and Robert are saying, the needs of students who access community colleges, who they are, what they have experienced in their education, and what community college can give them, I think is substantially different than what we would get from maybe a lot of these online programs. So it may be important to just step back and think about, like, what is it that what is the community college's mission? How are they serving their local community, whether it be through workforce training, whether it be through, a lot of these community colleges have like GED prep or GED classes. These are things that you can't get through other types of educational institutions. And therefore, they validate and continue to validate the missions of community colleges and help us recognize their continued need.
Yeah, thank y'all for that. And I also think it's, part of the challenge that I think a lot of higher education is facing is finding ways to effectively communicate all that higher education institutions do, the ways that they are sort of tied into the fabric of our society. Okay, we'll see how much time we have, but we'll definitely get to this question at least. So what do we know about the extent to which local funding contributes to overall funding adequacy? Do states with more reliance on local funding tend to fund community colleges overall at a higher level, which actually is really similar to another question. So I'm sort of combining them, which I think is a little bit tied to a bit of like our findings from the forthcoming ARA open paper. So maybe Justin, you want to take a stab at that to start?
Sure. Basically, what we're finding is that in the pooled analysis, whenever a community college is subject to both state funds and local funds, are getting more funding overall. So the kind of narrative that the states are just going to see that local funding as a component and then just like fund less is really not reflected from the data. I don't feel comfortable just saying that is point blank the way it is. I think that this is something we're going to continue to explore, but we have some early findings suggesting that there is a positive influence of having a dual funded community college as far as the total institutional revenue as the outcome. But Robert, I saw you unmuted if you have anything to add to that question.
Yeah, I was gonna say, those results do not apply in Arizona, where basically there is no state funding anymore. And I think that's a case where the state has said, we've had so many other preferences to use our money, we're gonna let the local communities handle this. And I think that's a challenge that we really could face again during the next recession. And that's an area that certainly deserves more research. How does that interplay change, especially when state budgets are under stress and they're trying to shift the cost onto local communities?
Well, I think that is a perfect way to wrap this up. So I want to say thank you again to my fabulous co-authors. Thank you all for joining us and asking such really awesome questions. This is like a nerdy episode of a podcast, so I really appreciate the opportunity to just get to engage more on this. As I mentioned previously, you can always check out our website, informedstates.org. If you want to look at any of our briefs, if you want to see a recording of this webinar, if a question pops up in your mind in the future that you are interested in learning more about this project or any of our other projects, you're always welcome to email us at info@informedstates.org or email someone that's on here, and we can definitely get that email to the right person to be able to answer. Okay, thank you all so much, and please have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.